Joining us on the line is Rav Arora. He's a 20-year-old journalist. He's written a bunch of essays in the New York Post that have gone viral. His latest essay, sure to go viral, is all about how Minneapolis residents overturned their decision to defund the police. Rav, thanks for joining the show. Really appreciate it.
Hey, Ben. Good to be back on the show.
So let's talk about your article here. So Black Lives Matter was supposedly about saving black lives. Obviously, that did not happen in Minneapolis. There was a push to defund the police. The corner on which George Floyd died actually became sort of a hotbed of violent activity. There was tape that was going around pretty recently of people committing shootings at the George Floyd Square. So how have the opinions of people in Minneapolis shifted on the cops from pro to anti and then back to pro?
Well, actually, they haven't shifted at all, according to the people that I interviewed for the article. And I interviewed primarily the lead plaintiff in this lawsuit that happened in the city. And he's a Jamaican immigrant. His name is Don Samuels. And he lives in an area which historically has had some crime issues, but nothing to the level where it's at right now. And I'll talk about that in a second. But he told me that last year when the city council vowed to dismantle the police and then after defund the police, he and many of his fellow neighbors who are also black, they looked at that and they were completely shocked that was even considered. And then this was proclaimed as some kind of virtuous action to promote racial justice. And so he was completely shocked about what would happen in his community if police decided to stop doing their jobs or reduce proactive policing. And as I wrote about in my article, that is exactly what happened. So after George Floyd died, there were widespread anti-police protests, riots in Minneapolis and across the country, and a whole police precinct burned down in the city. And what happened was that police stopped engaging in proactive policing. They were essentially demoralized, and you had more than 200 officers that left the force in the city of Minneapolis, many due to medical leave and citing PTSD as the leading cause of that problem. And so you have a police department that's understaffed by more than 200 officers, all the while AOC, Ilhan Omar, BLM, progressive activists are cheering. And what happens is homicide last year skyrocketed, and last year became the second deadliest year in the city of Minneapolis. You had shootings go up, carjackings, robberies. You're seeing this kind of across the country. And so last fall, you had a group of Minneapolis residents who decided to sue the city for lack of police protection because they're calling the police in many cases, and they're not coming unless it is a complete life-threatening issue. And so in one anecdote that I recount in the article, the individual who I interviewed, he told me about a woman who was putting groceries in her house, and her car was open, and a group of men approached her and tried to break into the car and drive away. And she calls the cops, and they say, "This isn't life-threatening. Sorry, we can't come." And so this is kind of what's happening across the city of Minneapolis. You have police unable to respond to the wave of crime, and you see criminals who are emboldened, who see the signals, who saw the signals loud and clear last year of defund the police, abolish the police. So they have adjusted their behavior accordingly, and the police have also adjusted their tactics in light of the anti-police protests, and we can talk about how they've shifted.
So, Rav, before we get to how the police have shifted their tactics, why did the politicians basically cave to this sort of stuff? They must have had some sort of sense that a huge swath of the population, including a lot of black Americans living in Minneapolis, were not in favor of the police just going away. And yet you saw Jacob Frey, who is the mayor of Minneapolis, kowtowing to the BLM movement and talking about defunding the police. And you see all these police officers quitting. I mean, was the political class just that caught up in the Twitter of it all that they didn't pay attention to their own constituents? Or is there something else going on here?
Yeah, it's really disturbing and it's perplexing to me why that even happened. But it just seems to be that the loudest voices seem to get what they want. And the loudest voices are blue checkmark people on Twitter. There are people on CNN, people writing for the New York Times, people on MSNBC, progressive activists, BLM, that type of thing. And I've written about this a few times before, how BLM and the interests of BLM simply do not align with the interests of Black or any ethnicity residents in poor income communities that are ridden with crime. The interests of these two groups just simply don't align, because BLM wants to reduce police presence, as we all know, defund the police or outright abolish the police. But these people in these communities, that's not what they want at all. And politicians just, I guess, seem to have misunderstood fundamentally what the problem is, and they seem to have prioritized police reform, putting it charitably. They seem to have prioritized that over having a robust police force in the past year, and that just isn't true among people in high crime communities. There was a recent poll just a few days ago in The Economist, which showed that 74% of Black residents 74% of Black respondents in the survey viewed crime as a major problem, compared to 50% of white college graduates. So you have a racial disparity in concern and impact of violent crime, but these white college graduates, individuals who are in the media, who are running places like the New York Times, CNN, they're dominating the discourse, and they are focused most on white racism, on white supremacy. And so anything that doesn't fit that preconditioned narrative just gets completely excluded from our discourse. And this problem of intraracial violent crime just doesn't fit that mold of a white oppressor with a minority victim. And so you see the politicians just completely missing the point and making decisions that have costly consequences.
So, Rav, let's talk for a second about how the police have responded to all this. You mentioned that they are no longer policing non-deadly crime. When I was living in LA, it was a very similar situation. If some sort of crime occurred in your neighborhood and it was just a property crime, the police would show up, and even if they knew who the perp was, they would just leave. They would just say, there's nothing we can do, because as soon as we put them in jail, they're going to be released again, like immediately. So how did that play out in Minneapolis?
Yeah, so this was shown empirically in a paper released last year by law professor Paul Cassell. You had, in the aftermath of George Floyd, arrests, stops, police-initiated calls drop precipitously in Minneapolis. And you had this in various American cities, which we can talk about as well. And so you had reduced proactive policing, and proactive policing is shown to be one of the most effective strategies to reduce crime. It's basically the idea of police presence deterring criminal behavior in communities. And so you had police just completely drop the amount of stops they were making, arrests they were making. And a lot of that initially was part of them patrolling the protests and the riots and dealing with all of that. And so they were completely diverted. But after that, the costs of policing, Ben, were completely, they were raised to an absurd degree. And you see this continuously, not just with George Floyd, who, many officers at the time across the country were condemning the incident and saying this was horrible what the officer did, and we don't support this at all. But you have time and time again, when police do the right thing in some of these cases, like Jacob Blake, Rayshard Brooks, earlier this year, Ma'Khia Bryant, and you have the media, you have our activist class blame these officers for being racist. They distort these cases time and time again. Rayshard Brooks is one quick example. In Atlanta last year, he grabbed the officer's taser, fired it at him twice, and the officer shot it and ended up killing him, which was perfectly justifiable in that situation. And you had the city immediately fire the police officer. You had just completely misrepresentative, distorted media coverage highlighting that this is another case of an innocent black man being shot by a white officer. You had the LA Times in that case, in the Rayshard Brooks case, publishing an article about this being a case of being black while being innocent, while being at Wendy's or whatever. And so you see this time and time again of these cases where officers do the right thing, and they're shown as these racist actors doing the wrong thing. And so essentially you've raised the cost of policing, like I said. And so cops have shifted their behavior accordingly, because when they do the right thing, they're also blamed for it, scapegoated for that problem. And then also criminals have seen that signal, as I said earlier, and they have adapted as well, knowing that the police aren't engaging in the kind of proactive policing that they did before. And so the cycles of gang violence and gang retaliation have just escalated and skyrocketed over the past year in not just Minneapolis, but major American cities. And it's taken a disproportionate toll in Black communities.
So, Rav, let's talk for a second about a lawsuit that was filed by members of the Minneapolis community. They actually filed a lawsuit against the city of Minneapolis saying you refuse to protect us. Now, typically, these sorts of lawsuits go nowhere because courts have found that there is no actual obligation, believe it or not, legally by the police to protect you. But do you think there's a prospect that perhaps this lawsuit does go somewhere? And if so, what are the consequences?
Well, they ended up actually winning their case earlier this month, which I don't know if you heard about that happening. But as I show in the article, the judge ruled in their favor because they provided such a compelling case for lack of police protection. A lot of it they cited in the case was PTSD happening. A lot of the individual I interviewed talking about how a lot of children are unable to sleep in the neighborhood. They're scared of the gunfire that's ravaging their community. Parents are scared of sending their kids to school. You have nightly gunfire happening, and then carjacking have skyrocketed. And like I said before, police are completely unable to respond to the surge in homicides and violent crime. And so the judge looked at this, and there's really no room for debate here on this issue. The judge ruled in their favor, and now the city is required to hire something like 100, 150 more officers by 2022. And so the effects of this aren't going to be in play for a long time. So unfortunately for these community members in Minneapolis, it's going to take a while for these effects to come in. Right now, it's just the situation there is incredibly grim. It's nightly gang violence happening, and the media just seems to be ignoring the problem.
Well, Rav Arora, he writes for the New York Post. Go check out his work right now, doing excellent work on a wide variety of topics. His latest, of course, on the situation in Minneapolis, where the police have basically gone absent and the residents are paying the price. Rav, really appreciate the time.
Thanks, Ben. Appreciate it.